The discovery of the battered and lifeless body of a 12-year-old girl cast a shadow over the community of Springfield, Missouri. Within hours, a massive search for the child's killer was launched.
Sergeant Mike Rogers of the Violent Crime Support Unit of the Missouri State Highway Patrol was a key investigator on the case.
Rogers, can I help you? The critical time window in homicide cases is about 48 hours after the death occurs is when you usually gather most of your evidence. We really were set back on this case because it was obvious that the victim had been dead for several days, and there was no murder weapon, there were no witnesses.
13A61, 13A61, put the tag 2 for 13 Victor 6.
The victim appeared to be between 11 and 14 years old, and there were signs she had been sexually molested. The victim was quickly identified as 12-year-old Andrea Marks, who had been reported missing 6 days earlier. Andrea had last been seen walking home from a friend's house.
It's an emotional time, although as an investigator, you really can't let the emotions attach to you. You have to be objective and do your job. But, you know, here was a 12-year-old girl literally snatched off the streets of Springfield about 2 blocks from her home. And if you can't be safe that close to your home, where can you be safe? I really wondered what kind of a monster would do this to a defenseless girl.
An autopsy revealed that Andrea had been stabbed 4 times in the chest with an ice pick type weapon. Although the murder appeared to be sexually motivated, no semen was recovered from the body. Andrea's clothing was examined by Missouri State Patrol criminalist Jenny Smith.
Trace evidence involves little things, things that you need sometimes a microscope to examine. The clothing of the victim is really the most important thing to a person doing trace evidence. We're looking for any debris on that clothing that did not come from her environment. Hairs that are not hers, fibers that are not from her clothing or from her home.
Smith isolated 11 different types of particles that she hoped could connect Andrea to her killer.
Did you see her leave?
Investigators spoke to Andrea's friend, Tiffany Bryant, the last known person to see her alive. Tiffany Bryant told investigators that she and Andrea had spent the afternoon playing in the house. When Andrea walked home that afternoon, Tiffany left to return a rented videotape. Andrea was never seen alive again. Detectives began checking the whereabouts of all local registered sex offenders.
Initially, there were several suspects. I believe we had about 7 men that looked really good for this or possibly could be involved in the killing because they lived in close proximity to the victim. One had been known to harbor runaway girls the same age as the victim, and all of those needed to be eliminated.
Did you participate in the death of...
Through polygraphs and alibi checks, investigators dismissed each possible suspect one by one. With no new leads, investigators found themselves back at square one.
It becomes frustrating when you're working a case, especially as time wears on, but you just have to go back to good police work. You have to do and redo things you've done before. You have to look for any errors.
In reviewing their files, investigators found several inconsistencies in the statements made by Tiffany Bryant's stepfather, Tim Chaney, regarding his whereabouts on the day that Andrea Marks disappeared.
Chaney had been interviewed after the body was found and was very evasive and gave a long alibi story about where he had been, what he had been doing.
Under close scrutiny, Chaney's story didn't seem to hold up. No one could verify his alibi.
He gave an alibi of leaving his house, going to a nearby car wash. Car wash was full, so he left and went fishing at a nearby lake, then drove around, got lost, went to sleep or passed out, and then later returned home at about 10 o'clock or 10:30. And the only people that saw him return at that time were his next-door neighbors, who confirmed the time of his arrival back.
Got home about 10 o'clock, and my neighbors saw me. My neighbors saw me get home.
No one saw him at any time while he says he was gone or while he was out of the area.
Ready where I was. I got him.
Investigators suspected that Chaney knew more than he was telling. They obtained a search warrant to retrieve evidence from his van.
What was most frustrating was that we did not have a murder weapon, we did not have a witness, and we had a time lapse of 6 days between the time the victim disappeared and the time that she was found.
Despite their suspicions, investigators did not have enough evidence to arrest Timothy Chaney. If police were correct, a cold-blooded murderer was walking the streets of Springfield, Missouri, free to kill again.
With no murder weapon or witnesses, detectives working the Andrea Marks murder case hoped that microscopic trace evidence recovered from the 12-year-old victim's body would lead them to the identity of the killer.
Criminalist Jenny Smith compared trace evidence recovered from Timothy Chaney's van to samples taken from Andrea Marks' blouse.
Right away, I noticed some of the particles, the shreds of debris that I had seen on the girl's clothing. The most predominant particle being these little rubber pieces with like steel blue top layer, vinyl looking.
Although the trace evidence was promising, Smith could not make a conclusive match. To do that, she would need additional samples for comparison. Criminalists returned to Chaney's van.
It's important to note that Chaney had stated during his interview that the victim had not been in his van for at least a year.
I took them both to school that one time. It was a long time ago. I can't even remember.
And the victim's mother also told us that the blouse that she was wearing at the time of her death had just been purchased 3 days earlier. If those particles matched, that would prove that he was a liar.
As detectives waited for final lab results on the trace evidence, Missouri Assistant State Attorney General Bob Ossens began looking into Timothy Chaney's past. A dark portrait of a violent man emerged.
Well, Mr. Chaney apparently was out of a small town in southeastern Missouri. He was in his young 20s. He married a young teenager who had some younger sisters, 11 and 12 at the time of the marriage.
You have 2 sisters. Did you ever touch them?
He exposed himself to the younger sisters. There was some inappropriate touching, and he apparently abused the wife.
How many times has he struck you when you were with him?
After divorcing his first wife, Chaney moved in with a single mother.
Does he have a temper?
Yes, very violent, especially after he drank.
He had apparently lived with a woman in Springfield, and he had abused her and physically abused her son.
They all felt he was very capable of harming this young girl. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic, and we were able to document that very easily during the case.
The second set of samples recovered from Chaney's van confirmed criminalist Jenny Smith's initial suspicions.
From the vacuumings from the van, I could say, geez, these look like these, you know, right away. And then I started seeing red paint chips that I'd seen in both collections. And I started seeing turquoise 3-layer paint chips that I'd seen in both. I started seeing metallic shards and metallic spheres that I'd seen in both. I was seeing just about everything in the van vacuumings that I'd seen in the debris from the victim's clothing.
I felt in my mind, from what she had, the samples that she had compared, I think there were like 14 different standards that all matched, and they matched on several different levels. There was no doubt in my mind that Chaney was the killer.
It's not true. I didn't do it.
Timothy Chaney was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Andrea Marks. But with no murder weapon and no witnesses, the only evidence linking him to the killing had to be seen through a microscope.
The case against accused killer Tim Chaney relied entirely on complex expert testimony and state-of-the-art forensic science. Would it be enough to convince a jury that Chaney murdered his daughter's best friend?
Where it is not possible that this little...
Missouri Assistant State Attorney General Bob Ussens worked on the case for months before it went to trial.
Trace evidence can be crucial in a case, and in this case was absolutely crucial. The difficulty with trace evidence, of course, is that the comparisons that are made, either chemically or visually, are not always obvious to a jury. They have to be explained.
The prosecution opened their case by presenting the jury with a detailed description of the crime scene.
Apprehends the victim.
We use a lot of charts, maps, photographs, either through a microscope, regular photographs, aerial photographs of the locations in question.
Next, the prosecution offered their theory of how Timothy Chaney murdered 12-year-old Andrea Marks. Chaney left the house that afternoon at the same time as the girls. Police believe he caught up with Andrea shortly thereafter. After sexually assaulting and murdering Andrea, Chaney dumped her body outside of town. Although the ice pick-like murder weapon was never found, prosecutors were able to prove that Chaney had access to such a tool.
What we did find in Chaney's van was a tire repair kit that can be found at any local Walmart store. Missing from that tire repair kit was a large needle-type instrument similar to an ice pick, and that was probably used to stab the victim 4 times.
Was missing this particular device.
The prosecution offered compelling proof that Chaney had both the opportunity and the means to murder Andrea Marks. But they knew that their case hinged on complex trace evidence.
The main thing we wanted to do was to make sure that the jury understood how it was the trace evidence made it so clear that Mr. Chaney was guilty. We had actual photographs through a microscope of the various pieces of trace evidence.
Mr. Ossens devised a chart or a diagram to show them a picture of the van, somebody depicting Mr. Chaney, and another depicting the victim. And he used colored dots to designate different particles.
We had found some fibers of the victim's blouse in the van right here.
He would say, okay, you found these rubber pieces here in the van, and he'd put a blue sticker on the van. And then he'd go up and you found these similar rubber pieces on the victim's clothing. He'd go put another blue sticker on the victim's clothing. One particle is good, but when you see so many similar particles, it makes the evidence even stronger.
The jury was not only being told by an expert that these things matched, they could look at the screen and see that they matched, and all that was important.
Finally, accused murderer Timothy Chaney took the stand in his own defense. He insisted that Andrea Marks had not been in his van for more than a year. He confirmed that she was at his house the afternoon she disappeared, and offered that as his explanation for the trace evidence.
There was an argument from the defense that because the victim had been at the home of Mr. Chaney earlier that day, visiting his stepdaughter, that she could have gotten these particles on her clothing from being at his home.
She was in my van, and she's been in my house many times, and
the argument being that this would, that the particles in the van were tracked into the home, and the victim went to this home and then got the particles on her clothing. Another important thing about this transfer of this debris onto the victim's clothing was that there was so much of it. We're talking, in lay terms, as much of it as a teaspoon. And I could have gotten more. So it's a far reach to imagine that you could sit on somebody's couch or bed and get up and have a teaspoon of debris from that object.
After 2 weeks of testimony, The Timothy Chaney murder trial was handed over to the jury. Chaney's guilt or innocence rested on a teaspoon of dust. His fate was now in the hands of the jury.
I think the hardest part of any case is the waiting. When the jury's out, our fate is in someone else's hands. We've done our best to persuade them, but that doesn't mean we've been successful.
After careful deliberation, the jury returned to pass judgment on Timothy Chaney. They found him guilty of first-degree murder. For many on the jury, the trace evidence was the deciding factor.
The part of this job that is probably the most gratifying is that when you do contribute to the outcome of a case in a favorable way, and justice has really been served, and you've been a part of that.
The people that I was most concerned about were the family, and they were pleased. They're not pleased to have lost their granddaughter, daughter, niece, but they were pleased that justice had been done.
The jury condemned Timothy Chaney to death, but on appeal, his sentence was reduced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at the Potosi Correctional Center in Potosi, Missouri.
The Andrea Marks murder investigation was a successful test case for the Missouri State Patrol's Violent Crimes Support Unit. Their use of an advanced computer database which correlates and cross-references key evidence proved invaluable in bringing Tim Chaney to justice. I'm Brian Dennehy. Join me for the next episode of Arrest and Trial. The discovery of the battered and lifeless body of a 12-year-old girl cast a shadow over the community of Springfield, Missouri. Within hours, a massive search for the child's killer was launched.
Sergeant Mike Rogers of the Violent Crime Support Unit of the Missouri State Highway Patrol was a key investigator on the case.
Rogers, can I help you? The critical time window in homicide cases is about 48 hours after the death occurs.
Days earlier, Andrea had last been seen walking home from a friend's house.
It's an emotional time, although as an investigator, you really can't let the emotions attach to you. You have to be objective and do your job. But, here was a 12-year-old girl literally snatched off the streets of Springfield about 2 blocks from her home. And if you can't be safe that close to your home, where can you be safe? I really wondered what kind of a monster would do this to a defenseless girl.
An autopsy revealed that Andrea had been stabbed 4 times in the chest with an ice pick type weapon. Although the murder appeared to be sexually motivated, no semen was recovered from the body. Andrea's clothing was examined by Missouri State Patrol criminalist Jenny.
It's when you usually gather most of your evidence. We really were set back on this case because it was obvious that the victim had been dead for several days, and there was no murder weapon, there were no witnesses.
13A61, 13A61, attack 2 for 13, Victor 6.
The victim appeared to be between 11 and 14 years old, and there were signs she had been sexually molested. The victim was quickly identified as 12-year-old Andrea Marks, who had been reported missing 6 Smith.
Trace evidence involves little things, things that you need sometimes a microscope to examine. The clothing of the victim is really the most important thing to a person doing trace evidence. We're looking for any debris on that clothing that did not come from her environment, hairs that are not hers, fibers that are not from her clothing or from her home.
Smith isolated 11 different types of particles.